Some faces I recognise here, not an awful lot. I'm Michael Evans from The Times. James Appathurai, all of you I'm sure will know. He has been standing up for NATO now for quite some time. Always easy to get hold of, which is, I think, one of the best qualities of someone in his particular job. Never fails to get back to you. We have got this particular meeting on a rather apposite time, I think, because yesterday, I don't know how many of you were involved in the Robert Gates story yesterday, written originally by Peter Spiegel, who used to be on the FT, so I know him very well, now on the Los Angeles Times. Robert Gates was quoted, as I'm sure you know, casting aspersions on NATO in southern Afghanistan without actually spelling out who was in southern Afghanistan, but someone should have told him that it was mainly Britain, Canada, the Danes, the Dutch and the Australians, and all of them thought his remarks were out of turn, to say the least. We can talk about that, James can talk about that, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions on that later on. But I would like, first of all, to introduce James and let him fire away. Say what you like, James, but I think if you could focus perhaps initially on Mr. Robert Gates.
First, thank you all for coming, and I hope we can have an interactive discussion, because I suspect a lot of you know as much about all of these subjects as I do, so it'll be nice to talk. Yeah, Mr. Robert Gates, I think this is symptomatic of the spokesman's job, which is plan to be on offense, always be on defense. And this one was not where I was expecting. It was a bit of a Maginot Line strike, that one. Secretary Gates has been, and through his staff, pushing very hard to clarify what he said. And we spoke immediately. I didn't know that was the funny part. And we spoke immediately, obviously, to the Pentagon to find out what exactly he had meant. And what he had meant was, of course, not to point specifically at the countries of the South. And I think to back him up here, he has been very clear for months, in fact, that he lavishes praise on the Canadians, the Dutch, the British, and the Danes, and wouldn't come with this sort of a strike on them out of the blue. But I do think he had a larger point to make, which is something that if you put the sensitivities of national politics aside, and I can tell you I've been on a lot of Canadian and British outlets in the last 2 days trying to calm the waters, so I know it is very sensitive in these countries, the Dutch too. It's his larger point that we are learning as we're going in Afghanistan, and what we did 4 years ago is not what we're doing now, and there's a reason why we're doing things differently, because we have to learn new ways of doing things. We have to pair up the military and the civilian effort much more closely than we're doing, and I'm sure we'll talk about the possible appointment of Lord Ashdown today, or certainly the appointment of a super envoy, precisely because we need to not do things in sequence but do things in lockstep, and that means breaking down some very fundamental barriers in terms of culture and suspicion. When I was at the Defense Department in Canada, I can tell you the NGOs didn't want to see us a mile away. The UN, very suspicious of NATO 10 years ago. Now we're much, much closer together than we were, and that will get deeper in the coming months, I expect. With the EU, well, we should be closer, but we're not. Many of you know the story there. But I think his larger point that we need to look carefully and share best practices about how to do this in Afghanistan is well taken once we get past the more obvious sensitivities.
I must say, what I never understand, and I didn't understand it when Gates said it yesterday, was that he's referring to the fact that the old story about the Cold War has ended, but all the members of NATO are still lined up, as it were, with the Cold War in mind, which is complete nonsense. I mean, certainly the principal members of the alliance with proper military forces have reassigned their troops, have retrained their troops, have changed their troops. There's no question of still being stuck in the Cold War. So I don't know why he made that suggestion that, you know, we were all sort of still thinking in that form, which is not true. And certainly, when you think how long the major players have been in Afghanistan now, I think it could be safely said that most of the players have now learnt the counterinsurgency role, and in Britain's case, of course, we've been involved in counterinsurgency since I don't know when.
Indeed, and I'm not Secretary Gates' spokesman. I'll just make this point here. But I can say, if I speak for the Canadians, that, as I say, things are different now than they were even 3 or 4 years ago. You might also look not just at the training, but also at the equipment. We do need to change. We have huge fleets of fighter aircraft, big fleets of tanks, which are of relatively limited use in this kind of environment. We need armored personnel carriers that have the kind of armor underneath it to protect against roadside bombs, and that's not the kind of thing we were building before. I do believe, I think you're right, that there has been a huge transition in the way we look at things. But I also believe that this transition is beginning, it is underway, and to think that we've learned, all of us, and that includes the Americans, I have to say, have learned all the lessons there are to learn, and it's done, that would also be wrong. So plenty of room for everybody to improve.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
As well.
And I can see from various faces here, there are people here who've been to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And
how can you tell from their faces?
I can attach names to faces. That's why. But
I'd love to know how you do that.
I'd like to. I mean, you know, later on in questions, we can direct the questions to these guys.
Yeah.
But it is quite clear that there are huge lessons to be learned, and one of the lessons that certainly I've come across when going to Afghanistan is that the British troops or the Americans or the Canadians, whatever it is, they do a fantastic job in taking on the Taliban. They have a ferocious fight that lasts for 48, 72 hours. They destroy them, they run away, everything's terrific. All these sort of logistics and statistics are put out about how successful it was. And then literally 2 or 3 weeks later, the troops have had to withdraw because there are not enough of them, and the Taliban come back in. And I think that's one of the things which is going to keep NATO forces in Afghanistan for a long, long time. And that's perhaps one of the lessons that needs to be learned. I guess it means we need more troops in the right places.
Well, I think it means we need more troops, but that doesn't mean we need more foreign troops. And it means we need more police. And we need better police. I don't think there's any mystery here. We have an Afghan battalion, the Afghans have a battalion coming off the assembly line probably once a month now. There's 39 Afghan battalions. We have them deployed, I'll use the Canadian example, in Kandahar. There's 2 Afghan battalions and 1 Canadian battalion, and it's working quite well. Afghans were in the lead taking back Musa Qala, and that's not James's spin, that's the truth. So we can start to see that the Afghan army is A, present, and B, starting to be able to do things independently, in the lead. But what does that mean? It means we have to provide them trainers, and NATO is critically short of trainers. We are now at about half of what they need currently in terms of embedded training teams, and they're, as I say, producing 1 battalion a month, and we're just getting farther and farther behind. The U.S. has provided this 1,000 trainers, but that's for a limited period, and we'll see if they stay or not. But NATO certainly has to make a much, much greater effort to on training, and we have this summit coming up in Bucharest, and you will see the discussion within NATO shift. It is shifting to see how we can step up significantly our effort in that regard. The other area is the police, not NATO's business, but the police are at least 4 or 5 years behind the Afghan National Army. I don't reveal any secrets, especially to those whose faces tell me that they were in Afghanistan, that they have been until very recently and are still underpaid, undertrained, sometimes corrupt, often ineffective. And they're the ones who are supposed to hold. It is not for the armed forces to hold. We clear. Someone else has to hold. And that's where the European Union, for example, in NATO's view, and the UN, but certainly the EU, has to step up its game when it comes to training and provide more training for the Afghan police, because 160 trainers, which is an effort that we welcome from the European Union, is not going to be enough.
That's very kind, 160, yeah. I mean, you'd have thought the lesson would have been learnt from way back, the Balkans, Iraq. The same problem has been the police. The police aren't there to back up what the military achieve.
Yes, that's true, but I think there's a much larger sort of intellectual discussion to be had about, again, this is Bob Gates' modern counterinsurgency. We have whole systems in place for deploying huge numbers of military people, and I don't just mean that we have the planes in place. They get promoted. They're supposed to deploy. They get promoted when they deploy. They have insurance. Their families are taken care of. There's rotation schedules. For the whole world of the civilian effort, on which our military effort depends, the police, the judges, the civil administrators, we don't have big reserves of them. If they leave, they're taking leave without pay. Who's covering their insurance? Are they promoted when they come back? Oh no, they've just been out of the office. They may as well have been at Hewlett-Packard. Their families are not taken care of. So there is a huge discussion to be had on the civilian side about how we do peace operations now. Not from the military side, but how do we get the civilians there, and how do we keep them there, and how do we get the best of them? There's 3 or 4 countries in NATO that can deploy police. The Carabinieri from Italy, the Dutch have some, the Maréchaussée, and the Canadians have the RCMP, but that's a pretty short list. And try to get a judge to leave his $400,000 a year job to go sit in Kabul and train judges. Sorry, they don't do it. So there's a big discussion to be had there.
You mentioned Musa Kala. What's your take on Musa Kala, the way that Musa Kala has been dealt with? Do you remember originally it was in the summer of 2006 when they had that so-called deal with the tribal elders. British troops withdrew and the Taliban walked back in again. That obviously didn't work. Whether it's working now, we've now got this very colourful former Taliban in charge of Musa Kala. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe that'll work. But do you think NATO, as it were, or its involvement in Musa Kala, did that work?
Well, I think the way Musa Kala has changed hands recently, you could draw a few lessons from that are, I think, encouraging. One is the Taliban had months to prepare for this. And they literally entrenched, dug trenches, laid mines, prepared, said we're going to stand and fight. 2 days, it's over. The lesson I draw from that is, and I think it's easy to draw, is they cannot hold territory against Afghan and Western forces. It's not news, but it's worth pointing out. Second point, there is a large discussion in Afghanistan, again no secret to the Afghan experts here, that President Karzai's effort at reconciliation, as he calls it, in other words, engaging with the non-ideological, the non-super hardliners in the Taliban movement, has some traction. Kabul is buzzing with this discussion now. It's buzzed before, but it is certainly buzzing now. And that for a number of reasons. One is the very high pressure that the extreme Taliban leadership is under from NATO and from the Operation Enduring Freedom. They are getting pressured, and I'm using the nice word for pressured. And there are those who, in the second tier, want to engage. They're concerned about how to do it, and this Taliban commander flipped. Now, Afghanistan has a long history of flipping and then flipping back, but he has flipped. He has brought his soldiers with him. He is now loyal to the government. He's a governor. And so, second lesson is you can engage with certain Taliban, and they can, in fact, hear a different message and take a different path. The third lesson is this time we know what we're doing, and as soon as this transition had taken place, aid and development poured in, and the people of Musa Kala are seeing the benefits in a very practical sense of siding with the government as opposed with the Taliban. Final point, and I mentioned it already, the Afghans really did, in terms of the army, take the lead. They fought with our support. So they retook the town. It was their victory. And the final point from my point of view is we handled it properly from a media point of view. In other words, not having me stand up and say, we took Musa Kala. Have the Afghans stand up and say, we took Musa Kala, which was the truth and which spoke to their people that they were taking back their own country. And that is a critical transition. We have got to stop talking for the Afghans and let the Afghans talk for themselves. And we are pushing resources to help them learn how to do it. For example, when I started this job, they were calling press conferences, but at 9 p.m., and getting a journalist out at 9 p.m. is a hard thing to do, and then not issuing any kind of media advisory. So unsurprisingly, nobody showed up. They're learning all of this as we go.
And Paddy Ashdown, what sort of role do you think he can play? Obviously, it's a UN appointment, not a NATO appointment, but...
Well, Paddy Ashdown hasn't been named. And I'm not going to name him because that's for the UN to do, and I'm not sure any decision has been taken. But many of you have written the articles, I'm sure, which I read today about Ashdown. Let me just talk about the super envoy, as we call him, or the gorilla, as he has also been called. And that's not referring to Ashdown, but to the job. There has been insufficiently weighty leadership of the UN operation in Afghanistan. I'm so sorry to the person who was doing it, but I think that's pretty much a consensus view, and it's no criticism of him. He just didn't bring with him the weight to do this, the political connections, the stature, the profile. But this job of civilian coordination is critical. There's a lot of focus in the media, and I understand that, on the military side. It's what gets the headlines, it's flashbang, it bleeds, it leads, and of course journalists are embedded with the military, so by definition it gets all the attention. But in fact, on the military side, despite all the differences of points of view, we have one plan, we have one set of rules of engagement, and we have a command structure that leads up from the NATO side to the North Atlantic Council. And we have day-to-day, minute-to-minute steer if we need. So there's something there. On the civilian side, there's nothing in terms of coordination. There are plans and the occasional structure which comes and goes, but which is haphazardly applied. The UN effort is absolutely critical to coordinate this. There has been, let's say, a number of disparate police training efforts that didn't have the same model. One model is to train paramilitary police. The other model was to train basically beat cops from southern Bavaria who write tickets. Again, no criticism, that's just the way it was. The aid effort is very, very fragmented, uncoordinated, not in general according to the priorities of the government. We made a decision when we as an international community went into Afghanistan, and that was to choose a provincial model for the military and to choose lead nations for each different area of development. Japanese do this, Germans do that, under the G8 model. What did that mean? It means we look at Afghanistan through a straw. Everybody looks. It's the ultimate stovepipe, or collection of stovepipes. It's like the roof at the end of Mary Poppins. For those of you who've seen Mary Poppins, you know, they dance around and all you can see is 1,000 chimneys. And I think about that sometimes. Because if you're Canadian, for you, Afghanistan is Kandahar. Our journalists go straight to Kandahar. The aid money goes straight to Kandahar. The diplomats go straight to Kandahar. For the Dutch, it's Uruzgan. And all they talk about is Uruzgan. For the British, it's Helmand. And it has created a fragmented structure, which, by the way, impedes rotation. Because if you've invested so heavily in one area and you've got to know the lay of the land, you've got to know the people, which is absolutely essential, and people have come to trust you, then you don't just pack up and leave. So that has been not very good for rotation/solidarity. The same is true of the development project. People said to the Japanese, you're in charge of disarmament. Great. But it didn't mean, and we'll all support you in your effort. It meant you're in charge of disarmament. And so they were kind of left alone. So on the civilian side, there is a great need for stronger leadership in terms of coordination in the country. And let me add one final point. We also need much, much more high-level political attention to Afghanistan than we are getting. My understanding is the EU has never, ever had a summit-level discussion of Afghanistan. Not once. Whereas we have it all the time. That's our bread and butter. And it's a little bit schizophrenic because we have 21 of the same members. It's their soldiers in Afghanistan. But the civilian side is simply not getting the same high-level political attention. And someone like Lord Ashdown, if it is him, who is named, who has a mandate from the UN to go to capitals, beat on the door and say, focus on this. You can't ignore Lord Ashdown if it is him. That's quite clear. So we need someone of that stature who can help give us that kind of coordination. And I can tell you NATO will coordinate with him, or with the super envoy, whoever it is, as closely as possible.
So before we move away from Afghanistan, are you reasonably optimistic about the way Afghanistan is likely to go in the next 4 or 5 years?
I think, sorry, this is going to be a moment of spin, so those of you who choke on it, you're going to have to control yourselves for a second. On the development side, you can be, I think, unequivocally positive. Not unequivocally, that's too strong. But you can be encouraged about what's happening in Afghanistan. And I can rattle off all the statistics for you, but I would, so not to be spinning too much, direct your attention very simply to what the UN says, the UNAMA says about what's going on in Afghanistan. But to give you 5, let's say, basic facts. Economy has tripled, personal incomes have doubled, 6 million kids in school, of which 2 million are girls. Access to health care in the last 6 years has gone from 88% to 82 or 83%, which I think if I understand correctly, is better than almost any, if not all, of the African countries, despite 40 years of development assistance. You've got 15 banks, 3 million Afghans have mobile phones. I could go on and on. There really is encouraging progress. Narcotics, a mixed story. Half the country should be, according to UNODC, poppy-free, the northern and western half. Though there's a new problem because I saw an Afghan soldier, I'm sure you've seen this picture, very enthusiastically covered in camouflage, which is marijuana plants, all stuck into his helmet, because that's the new crop up in the north. But it's a different problem. We all don't mind that. Where we have a problem is principally Helmand. No news to anyone. The Taliban, like any mafia, is protecting the crop, taking its 10%, or whatever it is, and using it to fund the insurgency. And of course, those drugs are all in London's back alleys and schools. So this is our problem. It's not abstract. But can it work, counter narcotics efforts? Yes. Where there is security, it is working in Afghanistan. And let's look next door. Pakistan was the world's biggest producer of opium in the 80s. I think it was something like 980 tons in 1985. By 1997, that was 25 tons. By 1999, it was 2 tons. Turkey has tackled it. Thailand has tackled it. It can be done. And we can discuss, if anybody wants to, how we could address that issue. The security front. This is obviously the biggest challenge because, by the way, it undermines the narcotics effort, etc., and vice versa. And there is, of course, the border. And the border is one of the major complicating issues. There is support coming for the Taliban across the border. And to a certain extent, and this is not official NATO policy, so I'll just caveat this, but in the past there have been those who said that support from Pakistan for the Taliban was to provide strategic depth for Pakistan. What's happened now is Pakistan has become strategic depth for the Taliban. It is blowback into Pakistan, and they are facing a very, very difficult problem. Which is why Pakistan has to be part of the solution to this challenge. There's no doubt, and that will be a great, great challenge for Pakistan. And we will, of course, stand ready to support that. But to my mind, and again, now I'm not speaking official NATO policy, we can't expect to see the Taliban insurgency eradicated in the next 5 years. I don't think it's possible. But what we can see is, for the first time, a vision of where we're going. And that is that at a certain stage, the Afghans will be in the front, NATO will be providing, and international forces will be providing close air support, transport, in extremist support, emergency help, medical evacuation, and if necessary, a full military backup, but that the Afghans take the lead in the fight. And I can tell you that's exactly what they want. Minister Wardak, President Karzai, very clear, let us do it. Give us the equipment, give us the training. And they say very consistently, it is a shame to us that your soldiers, ours, are buried in our country. It is a shame to us, and they want to move to the next phase as quickly as possible. So I'm encouraged that the training and equipping effort is starting to get traction, and that at a certain stage it is realistic to move to that next phase. And the question is, how quickly will we do it? How well will we do it? But we will get there. And that wasn't just spin. I think that.
So despite what Robert Gates said, do you think Afghanistan has, as it were, saved NATO as an alliance?
I wouldn't say it saved us. I don't think we were in big trouble. And I do think there are a whole host of other issues, aside from Afghanistan, where NATO is quietly exploring its own evolution. One of them is cyber defense. For those of you who don't follow Estonian affairs hyper closely.
No, we all do.
You might remember a few months ago, I think it was over a year ago now, that Estonia came under a sustained, directed cyber attack. Banks were shut down, government services were shut down, home banking, home internet was shut down. And for a country like Estonia, where apparently 98% of the population does their banking exclusively by internet, this was a major problem. I can tell you this can happen here. It can happen in any one of our countries. And we need to look as an international community, and NATO only where we can add value, but NATO is looking at policy and approach on how we can cooperate on cyber defense. We sent an expert up to support the Estonians. It turned out the Estonians knew exactly what they were doing. But it is by definition a multinational issue. It is by definition a security issue. And so this area there, energy security, there are discussions within NATO as well. And we have taken on a role in an ad hoc basis, for example, in responding to emergencies. When the Pakistani earthquake came, the UN asked NATO to airlift its supplies. We airlifted 3,000 tons or so of supplies into Pakistan, took people out of the mountains with a limited number of helicopters. It was a happy moment for a spokesman when I was told by the military that we had 40 helicopters in Pakistan, and so I proudly said this because that was the big issue of the day, that we had 40 helicopters. And then Mark John of Reuters called me the next day and said, "Yeah, hi James, I counted and it's 8. And I said, "Is that 38? He said, "No, it's 8. So then I had to go up and say it was 8, which was less good.
But I think it's fair to say that without Afghanistan, NATO was having a fairly shaky period. It was taking on a lot more people, more countries. It was becoming a vast organization. There weren't any there didn't seem to be a proper way forward for the alliance. It took a lot of stick, I think, over a period of 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And Afghanistan, in many ways, provided a sort of lifesaver to give you a proper mission. I know you mentioned all these other missions, and we'll talk about those as well. But Afghanistan, it seems to me, provided the alliance with something to get their teeth into, and therefore, if they fail, it would be disastrous, both obviously for Afghanistan, but also for the alliance.
Yeah.
And I think although that may sound like a cliche now because it's been said many times, I think it's probably true.
You're absolutely right that when I took my job, the question was, why is NATO still around? That was the big, existential think tank Rusi question. And now the question is not why is NATO still around, but can NATO succeed? Does it have the resources to do the things it has to do? I think it's no news to anybody here that there has been a clear evolution in the, let's say, the distribution of labor when it comes to international security. In the 90s, when I was at the Defense Department, everything was done through the UN. Tens of thousands of troops all over the world, which they have again, by the way, but that was the first port of call. And after the Balkans, for all the reasons that we know, for good or for bad, in general, Western countries have directed more of their high-end security operations through NATO. And we are essentially contracted out by the UN to do Afghanistan. If NATO fails in Afghanistan, the UN fails in Afghanistan. And I don't mean that just in a metaphysical way. A, it's a UN mandate, but secondly, if you ask Chris Alexander, the deputy head of UNAMA, if NATO goes, they can't do their work anymore, and they will go. So it is not just NATO that will go down and the Afghans that will go down in stature and in relevance if this mission fails. It will be the UN as well. You call it a lifesaver for us. I can tell you on a day-to-day basis, sometimes it's a lifesaver, sometimes it feels a bit like a millstone. It's a thorny little lifesaver, let's call it that way.
And what about something which I've always been very skeptical about, and that is NATO's love-in with Moscow? It never seems to have really quite gelled, it strikes me, that we've had all kinds of Russian NATO forums and things, lots of talking shops, but nothing really, it seems to me, you'll probably say I'm wrong, but nothing it seems to be of real substance that would make the Russians feel that NATO is, really wants to be a proper partner, especially perhaps in the last 12 to 18 months, with Mr. Putin taking on a more aggressive role as leader. The relationship with NATO, I would say, is probably not that good at the moment. Do you think that's largely true?
Is it not that good? Well, it's a mixed bag. I think that's fair to say. And love-in, I've never heard anyone use that word before. I don't know what's in that juice, but it's got its good aspects and its bad aspects. One thing that is structural and that is new is what we call the NATO-Russia Council. And it's an interesting structure because we used to have what we called the Permanent Joint Council, and that was Russia on one side and the 26 NATO countries on the other side. And we would agree, the NATO allies, on a position and then come to the table. And the Russians, I think, rightly complain, sorry, but that's not really negotiation, because if they had a different point of view, then we had to go renegotiate amongst 26, which was so painful nobody wanted to do it. Then we created a new body, permanent, the NATO-Russia Council, and that's not 26 plus 1, it's 27. Russia sits in alphabetical order, And we don't, on the issues that are discussed there, pre-cook the position amongst the 26. They come, they negotiate from the beginning, and we have a whole host of joint projects. So already the fact that we have this structure, which has not existed in Europe for quite some time, is good. And I can tell you the Russians do come to the table, they do negotiate on, or discuss and negotiate on missile defense, on Kosovo. We have very profound discussions, on Georgia. I mean, the real issues are being discussed there. We also have counter-narcotics training for Afghans and Central Asian countries, because that's a problem that Russia and the West face together, narcotics coming out of Afghanistan. We have a Russian ship sailing with our counter-terror operation in the Mediterranean. We have a common air picture. Now we're starting to hook up our air picture. So there's a good side to this. We disagree very fundamentally on some other issues. Kosovo is clearly one of those issues. Missile defense, there is great suspicion. NATO enlargement, very, very difficult for the Russian Federation to accept for reasons that I think we can all understand. NATO's point of view is we don't understand how spreading democracy and stability, even to Russia's border, is a problem, and we don't consider Russia a threat, and we don't really see why they should consider this a threat. Some of them do. So we really have to talk through these issues, and some I guess we won't be able to agree on. But certainly the days of shoe banging hopefully are behind us.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. But I think, although it's not necessarily a NATO issue as such, but the wish by the Americans to put missiles or tracking devices in the Czech Republic and Poland is obviously going to become, if it's not already, a sort of NATO issue, because they're both members of NATO. And did they come as governments to NATO and say, what on earth are we going to do about the Russians? I mean, the Poles now seem to be getting slightly cold feet about the whole thing anyway. But is there any sort of involvement with the Americans and the Poles and the Czechs all together to say, right, as an alliance, let's have a position on this?
NATO is actually quite actively engaged in that discussion, not least because there are many in Poland and the Czech Republic who would like to NATOize this discussion fully. Many opposition parties say that's the only way they'll accept it. In fact, the Socialist Party in the Czech Republic, I understand, will only accept missile defense if it's in NATO. I had trouble kind of modernizing my own thinking that this discussion was happening. But in essence, there are bilateral discussions, but those bilateral discussions are very much in a framework of the alliance. Everybody's fully informed. We have regular meetings, including of the NATO-Russia Council, where the United States puts up its sort of cartoon of missiles coming in and another missile hitting it, and then the Russian Federation puts up their cartoon of a missile but not coming close, and there's no reason for another missile. It's very funny. Clearly not very funny. It's funny to see, I'll tell you that. But we also have in NATO a discussion of building missile defenses, and that discussion is complementary to the American one. In other words, our principle is indivisibility of security. So we can't afford a situation in NATO where 9/10 of the alliance is covered, but the last bit, so sorry for you, let's say Turkey, Greece, and Bulgaria, you're out. So the NATO discussion has been to potentially complement an American system by building defenses for shorter range, lower level threats, and bolt it on to an American system if and when it is built. But you're quite right, the Russian Federation doesn't take very kindly to this system. I have to say, I cannot get my head around the concept that the Russian Federation feels threatened by 10 missiles with no warhead of any kind in Poland against their 6,000 missiles, by the way, predicated on the concept that this would in some way impinge their ability to destroy Western Europe or I don't know what. So I'm not quite sure I get my head around the Russian argument, to be honest, but it is clearly there and it is clearly very deeply felt. So we need to find a way to get to common ground on this.
It wasn't that long ago when NATO, quite a large number of NATO members, were pretty skeptical of the whole concept of Star Wars defense anyway. Obviously that was the Reagan concept, and now it's a much more limited thing. But do you think NATO as a whole is reasonably supportive of having a system like the Americans are proposing?
Actually, I do. We have an intelligence assessment in NATO It is agreed by all 26, and it agrees that there is a missile threat to Europe and that it is a growing missile threat to Europe. And the National Intelligence Estimate of the United States, which focused on Iran's nuclear program, doesn't diminish that aspect, which is missiles. So NATO allies agree there's a threat. Now, how best to deal with it, what kind of missile defenses, but in general, there's a pretty shared view in Europe that we need some kind of missile defenses. Now, the question is, how do we do it?
Is NATO prepared to spend money on it, though?
Well, we are certainly prepared to spend money on theater missile defense, because we are spending money on theater missile defenses, and contracts are being signed. And that's basically protection of deployed forces. But those can be easily adapted to other roles, and could potentially, for example, be bolted on to an American system. So, yes, they are willing to spend money on missile defenses, and willing to study, and that is an agreed and public position, willing to study the protection of allied forces and territory and populations. So yes, they are willing to do it.
And the other intractable problem, which you've already mentioned, is Kosovo. Any day now they could decide to be independent, to go independent. Is there any way around this one in persuading our Russian friends to go along with it?
The Russian Federation has been very clear that they will only go along with something that's agreed between Belgrade and Pristina. I don't know how much money I would put on agreement between Belgrade and Pristina in the next little while, but it's not much. So I don't frankly see, I'll be very honest, I don't see a way that in the next few weeks, if those are the timelines we're talking about, there's going to be agreement between these two parties. And if there is a declaration of independence, and if it is recognized by the United States and a majority of European countries, if not the near totality or totality of them, it has to be managed very, very carefully. It can unleash, if there is irresponsible behavior, negative consequences in terms of the security situation in Kosovo, in terms of what NATO considers to be an unnecessary and false linkage to other frozen conflicts in other parts of Europe or elsewhere. These things shouldn't be played with lightly, and there is potential for them to be played with lightly. So it is certainly an issue we have to watch very, very carefully.
Is there any intelligence of what the Russian sort of options are, what they might do?
Well, if there were, I wouldn't be sitting up here live streaming to YouTube to discuss it. I mean, there are no secrets that Russian politicians have, in public, made linkages to Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia. There is no secret of paramilitary groups, both in Serbia and in Kosovo, who have threatened all sorts of actions. There is no secret of a risk of movement of Serb minorities from enclaves in Kosovo, and all of the security risks that that brings. And our mandate from the UN is to protect freedom of movement, and we will do that, have no doubt. But it is going to be very complicated for our soldiers. I have to say, it's going to be even more complicated for the European Union, which is deploying a large civilian mission, and one which I can tell you NATO welcomes and wants to see there. But there are complex issues relating to mandate, and Belgrade has been very, very clear that they don't want that mission if anybody recognizes Kosovo. So the EU is going to have a lot of difficulty, I think, doing what we very much hope they need to do. But it's a bit more rocky waters for them than for us.
So is the relationship between the EU and NATO now on a much smoother path than it was, say, 3 years ago?
No. It's not on a smoother path. We know what we need to do together. We do a lot together. We need to do a lot more together in Afghanistan, in Kosovo, and beyond both of these theaters. But again, it is no secret that there is a political blockage between the two organizations related to issues largely unrelated to NATO and the EU on the security field. But we have difficulty with this. This is not, it is not nearly what it should be. And it's frankly beyond my pay grade, and the Secretary General, I think, believes it's beyond his pay grade to manage these issues.
But, I mean, obviously, from what you said, you still feel that EU has a significant role to play in various parts of the world. But there still isn't that sort of appreciation of what they can do and what NATO can do. There isn't enough sort of partnership feeling between the two sides at the moment.
To be honest, I think it's relatively clear what the EU and NATO would do in partnership with each other. I think the division of labor is relatively clear. There's a high end and a reach that NATO has, which the EU simply doesn't have and doesn't aspire to. There are geographic areas in which the EU is much more interested than NATO for reasons of membership, obvious to everybody. And that's okay. And there's plenty of work to go around. Look at Chad, look at Sudan. I mean, these are all areas where the EU is taking a lead, and that's very, very good because we are stretched in Afghanistan in NATO. We can't do everything. The problems are not between the organizations, and they're not intellectual. They are very much related to current political issues in a number of countries. I obviously can't go into specifics, but I think once we unblock this one problem, you can easily see a flood of cooperative projects between the EU and NATO. The frameworks are there, the understandings are there, and we just need to get over this speed bump, and then we'll see a lot more efficient use of resources between the two organizations once we can divide the labor and work more closely together.
Okay. I'm going to open up to the audience in a couple of minutes. Just one more question. What about further expansion of NATO? Do you think more countries are going to join in the next 4 or 5 years? Will there be countries that will upset Russia? And do you think Ukraine will ever actually make the move?
Well, do I think more countries will join NATO? Certainly. We have a summit coming up where there's 3 countries aspiring to NATO membership in the Balkans. As to whether none or all of them will get membership, that's to be decided soon, before April 2nd and 3rd. I have little doubt that there will be progress in that regard in terms of invitations issued at Bucharest. The big question, which you're kindly phrasing in a generous and gentle way, is Ukraine and Georgia, both of which have indicated that they're interested in joining. I understand from media reports, so I'm not revealing any secrets, that Ukraine intends to request membership action plan in Bucharest, so that they will come basically now and ask for that. I understand that they've actually posted that letter up on the Foreign Ministry website for anyone who's interested and reads Ukrainian. So it's not a secret. That will, of course, be not taken particularly well by many in Moscow who do not want to see Ukraine join NATO, but I don't think that that would be for tomorrow. Anyway, NATO has not accepted this. I mean, no discussion. First, no formal letter has been given to the Secretary General. Let me make that clear. Second, there has been no discussion in NATO, but this discussion is coming. And Georgia has just had a referendum. 70% of the population do want to join NATO, so I can't imagine that it will take too long for Georgia to be moving closer to NATO as well. It is impossible, of course, to guess where this is going to go. But countries that aspire to NATO membership have to meet the standards: political, economic, military, public support. The Zagreb has been pushing very, very hard not to sell NATO, but to explain NATO, to build the public support. And it has come up as we get closer to Bucharest. But if I look in Ukraine, we're not quite there yet. So there are many, many hurdles between Georgian or Ukrainian membership in some possible future and now.
But there's no limit to the number of members. It's not going to become too unwieldy an organization, do you think?
NATO is limited to the European democracies. That's the first point. That's in the charter. If it is to be changed, it'll be changed. But right now, that's the way it is. The rise in the number of members hasn't, to my mind, in most cases, affected the way we work. Just because you have more instruments in the orchestra in general, it doesn't mean you can't play all together. But on some issues, of course, that you have countries that come with a different historical perspective, different neighborhood. There it has broadened discussion. Sometimes it's slowed down a little bit. Certainly the committee meetings have become very long. Everybody wants to talk. They all pretty much say the same thing, but it takes a long time to get through the meeting. That I can tell you. And there's less parking.
Okay, James, thank you very much. I think we've covered not everything, but a lot, so thank you very much indeed. Right, you guys, I open it to the floor. If you'd like to say who you are, it would be nice for me to know who I'm talking to. David.
Hi James, I'm David Lloyd, I'm at the BBC. As you know, can I be very specifically and tediously challenge the specifics on the Musakala operation?
Yeah.
I was there, or not there actually. I was in Kabul and not able to go to the south. I've got three very detailed challenges on whether this was an Afghan-led media operation. Number one, the Afghan Ministry of Information said there were 4 civilian casualties and NATO insist on 2. Number two, the Afghans on the Monday said we've taken Musakala, and I was phoned up by a British spokesman in the south who said, hold on, we're not quite there yet, this is not going to be for a while. We and AFP went on the fall of Musakala because the Afghan government, and this was after all an Afghan-led operation, said it had fallen. AP and Reuters stayed away for another day. This may sound arcane, but it matters because if this is an Afghan-led operation, it's an Afghan-led operation. If the Afghans say we've taken the town, then I went up on the roof in Kabul and said we've taken the town. The week before, the Afghan Ministry of Defence had said the operation has begun, and I went up on the roof and said the operation has begun, and the British again said no, it hasn't. And I was in a bizarre email with General Branco, the only Spanish soldier in Afghanistan.
Portuguese, actually.
I beg his pardon. About whether it had or hadn't begun and who said it should or shouldn't begin. The reason for all this slightly odd detail is because other than 2 or 3 accredited journalists who happened to be lucky enough to be with the British at the time, this was not an operation that was covered at all independently on the ground. And you cannot come to a journalist club and say this was an Afghan-led military operation if we were not able to get access to what was happening on the ground.
Is that your question?
This was, no, I'm very nearly there. This was an operation in which 2 British soldiers died and no Afghan soldiers died. And in which the only footage that appeared 3 days after the Afghan Ministry of Defence said that the town had been taken, shot by a British combat camera crew, was Afghan soldiers on their own, with no British in shot, walking down the high street and flying the flag and taking what seemed to be a completely untouched high street of a town. It was propaganda footage of the very worst, and you cannot get away with it in the 21st century.
James.
Thank you for that question.
So with the question mark at the end, just about.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Listen, I was quite intimately involved in this particular effort, so I know a little bit about it, at least from my headquarters point of view. And I take your criticism of the way in which we, as a community of communicators, handled this quite rightly. It was jerky and incoherent. Yes, it's on. No, it's not. Yes, it's on. No, it's not. What that shouldn't tell you is, though, that we were behind the scenes like the Wizard of Oz, and just we've somehow disconnected the controls. We did, in fact, ensure that the Afghans were in the lead. That was the whole point. I'll show you, if you come to the headquarters, I'll show you exactly the direction that was given to ensure that they were in the lead, that they spoke for themselves, that they took the decisions. But I have to say, with due respect to my Afghan friends, they're not necessarily as experienced as we are at doing all of this. They don't have a very tight structure the way we do. And as a result, you get people saying things when maybe they're not quite sure, when they don't have authority, when they haven't been informed, or when it doesn't fit into the very tight choreography of what you're trying to choreograph. And in this particular case, a lot of things slipped out. As to the footage, I couldn't agree with you more. I don't like the way we do footage in Afghanistan. I am convinced that half the reason we have the problems that we have in terms of maintaining public support is video. The lack of video that we have. We only show bodies arriving at Kandahar airfield. People only see the negative stories. The Taliban, literal, and Al-Qaeda, literal cave dwellers are doing better than I am in producing the kind of video that we need, which is to show what's happening in the field. There is a major effort going on inside. I can tell you there has never been the kind of embed program for journalists as we have had in Afghanistan. We have huge discussions about this. Countries that have never embedded journalists ever are doing it now. It has been happening for years. I mean, I am fully with you. We need to do that. But let's recognize how far we've come. This is entirely new, and we have broken huge new ground when it comes to embedding. But thank you for that.
Thank you, James. Next question.
Gordon Adam from Media Support. We do communications for development in Afghanistan and a number of other countries. I'd like to challenge your sort of forward projection of where we're going. Are we winning? On a couple of counts. One is the question not so much of the Taliban losing or the Taliban winning as the government actually losing the plot. When I first went to Afghanistan after the liberation, as it were, or the military action in 2001, I could go down the street in Kabul, 8, 9 o'clock at night, in the darkness, flag down the first car, the first pair of lights that came towards me, ask for a lift. The car would always take me there and never accept a fare, and it usually wasn't a taxi. I'd never do that now. People are very much more suspicious of foreigners, and they're extremely disgruntled with the government. You talk about development in terms of education and health and so on, but there are large areas of the south where that's just not happening. For the simple reason the Taliban understand that this is going to be a block on their control of people, and they've stopped it. The bombing of the Serena Hotel is a very ominous sign. It seems to me that's an indication that they want to get at the foreign aid workers and discourage them from being present. And as you say, there are a number of very dedicated and quite high quality people in Afghanistan right now helping the aid effort.
James, unless you've got a specific question, do you want him to reply to that?
Well, I mean,
sure,
very
specific question
is this. I'm just wondering if your prognosis isn't a little bit optimistic. And secondly, I agree with you entirely, civilian-military cooperation is very important, but how can that be done when military rotations are happening every 6 months, when development is a long-term business, when there's a good deal of suspicion between the military and the development lobbies and the development and aid workers? I mean, I agree it's got to be done, but is this on your agenda? Is this something that you're going to tackle? I'd be interested to know how.
It is certainly on our agenda, but let's make sure not to put too much at NATO's door. There's a Dutch expression, I've learned lots of Dutch expressions in the last 4 years, and one of them is, he fell with his ass in the butter, which apparently means he has good luck. But another one is not to be an eat-all. NATO does not want to be an eat-all organization, and we cannot be responsible for coordinating the civilian effort, coordinating the NGO effort. That has to be done by other parties, and then we can coordinate with them to the maximum extent possible. And that's why the super envoy hopefully will take a step in that direction. There is an Afghan, you know this very well, I'm sure, the National Development Strategy. It is new. It is something we all subscribe to, and I understand from those who are expert on this, it's good. So hopefully that will help to coordinate the civilian effort as well. But NGOs, and I have a reasonable familiarity with NGOs, also need to want to be coordinated. And they are fiercely independent. They compete with each other. They compete with each other not least at funding time. I mean, let's not paint it as too innocent a problem. They have their own challenges to deal with, and it impinges on how we operate as well. So I see the challenge, but it needs to be done, but it needs to be done by the UN and by the EU and by the umbrella organizations for NGOs that are there, and they have to want to work with us. But I can tell you the military is ready. The military, more than any other group, wants the civilian effort to be stepped up. And I have seen their prognoses for where we need to go in chart form, and there's one line for the, well, there's one stream of lines for the military effort and how it needs to be adapted, and there's big lines for the civilian effort and how it needs to change, and they would love to see those lines filled in. So they are the first to want to work more closely with the civilian effort, but you're right, there are big cultural barriers. They need to be broken down, but they can be. I can tell you in my own defense ministry, we had someone from CARE Canada in the ministry. When we do exercises in Canada, the NGOs do the exercises with us. They have come to know us, we have come to know them. You can really do much, much better than we have done until now. In terms of things getting better, I hope I wasn't portraying this as too Pollyanna-ish, because I was quite clear, I don't think in the next 5 years the Taliban's going to be eradicated from Afghanistan. I really don't think so. The Serena Hotel, we have to be very careful to take it for what it is. The Serena Hotel is not a military target. It is not a political target. It is not a demonstration that the Taliban can take or hold territory. It is a propaganda target, exactly as you have mentioned, to scare people away. And we have to make sure not to be scared. The Taliban successes are in this area. They're at poking at us, at making us have these discussions here, and making people frightened to go there. And we have to resist it, we have to defend against it, but we also can't see it as military prowess, that you can walk into a hotel and kill a bunch of people. That is not military prowess. It is not a sign that they can succeed.
The guy in the back.
Sorry, I was once upon a time a British ambassador in Pakistan. I've got
What's your name?
2 questions.
What's your name?
Titus Walker. Won't mean anything, it was a long time ago. The first comment is that really, I think, had we been listening to a Soviet spokesman in the mid-80s, you would have been hearing almost exactly the same line as has come from NATO today. The first question I have is the NATO strategic objective the elimination of the Taliban because it is the, quote, front line of international jihadism, which is what we have been told? Secondly, at what point do you think there is a danger, or no danger, that Pathan Pushtun nationalism morphs with Afghan nationalism in rejection of foreign occupation, as it did, in fact, with the Soviets? So 1.2 questions.
Thank you. Let me reject very firmly the Soviet analogy, because I think we need to look, maybe they were saying the same things, but let's look at what they were doing. They were carpet bombing towns, poisoning lakes, and imposed a puppet government. They were hated by the people, and the government was rejected. 80% of the population in Afghanistan today supports the presence of foreign forces. All the polling data very clear on this subject, and that has been consistent for the last 5 years. A democratic government that cannot be legitimate, political parties forming that are not Pashtun in the parliament, with a speaker, Mr. Kanuni, who is also not Pashtun, who is a viable candidate if he wishes to run to be president. So I think this analogy has to be put to bed. It is facile, to my mind, to use this analogy. And then there's the second one, which is the Afghans. They always reject the foreign fighter, the foreign presence. Again, these historical analogies are limited by the fact that they are not rejecting foreign forces. They want foreign forces to leave when they're able to stand on their own 2 feet, and they are very, very clear about that. That is also true in the South. But in the South, we have a slightly different challenge, and that is it's not clear who's winning. And my friends who are living in Afghanistan say that there, the challenge is that there is a big number of Afghans who are sitting on the fence to see who's going to come out on top, because they don't want to support the government or Western forces and then find out that we're packing up and leaving and they're left on their own. The answer to that is, because you've all heard this famous cliche from the Taliban, you have the watches, we have the time. I'm not sure they ever said it, but anyway, that's what gets bandied around. My answer to that is very clear. Yes, we will leave at a certain stage. We will leave. And certainly we cannot sustain combat operations ad infinitum in Afghanistan. But the Afghan National Army and Afghan National Police, they're staying too. They have just as much time as the insurgency. And when we train and equip them and support them properly, they can carry on this fight, which will not be over in 5 years, not least because of the situation across the border. But I don't think we should let this idea that somehow the Afghans, A, love fighting forever. This is another little myth that circulates around, oh, they're just fighters, that's what they like. Second, oh, they like the Taliban, they like living under that regime, that's what they know. Or third, they just reject the foreign presence. None of those things are true. They're just not true.
Right.
My name is Nicole, and I'm a student and freelancer in New York. And I've just spent the last few weeks in Kosovo. And I mentioned something about the paramilitary groups. And I was interested in knowing exactly how big of a threat do you see them? Because I did some interviews with a couple of the members, and the general consensus of the population is that they are not a threat, and to most of them they don't exist. And also I'm interested in knowing if something like March 2004 happens again, what measures is KFOR going to take? Because they really lost the faith of the Serb population.
Thanks. To answer the first question, I have heard the same things that you have heard, and that the Tsar Lazar Guard on the Serb side, or the remnants of the KLA on the Kosovar side. No one knows how many members they have, but in general I can say this: the commander of KFOR is very confident that he can deal with these groups if and when they crop up. So I think there's no great concern on the part of NATO that these groups could get out of control. NATO thinks, the KFOR thinks they can handle them. March 2004, for those of you who don't follow Kosovo every day, there were, out of virtually nowhere and generally organized by mobile phone, riots in Kosovo in a number of areas, which I have to say caught us by surprise. We have radically restructured KFOR since then, and as a result of that, instead of having zones, the straw provincial model, we have task forces that can go anywhere. We didn't have much in the way of crowd and riot control capability. Now we do. Soldiers are trained for it, they're equipped for it, and they're also very, very aware that this can happen now. We will not be caught by surprise twice. And you will have no doubt that Commander KFOR is very, very focused on the Serb communities and patrimonial sites. And there are quite elaborate plans in place to move very, very quickly to protect them. So you're quite right to point at March 2004, because I think it's safe to say we were caught a little bit flat-footed, and it took a day or two to fly in the reserves and react properly to this, but we will not be caught flat-footed again.
Yeah, in the front.
Hi, my name is Sandra. I've been working in Kabul for a year and a half. My question is, how confident are you that the Afghans have the same goals and objectives as the international community in terms of, say, the style of democracy and governance that we're trying to sort of help them with, and getting rid of drugs, narcotics issues, the modernization, women, human rights? How confident are we still that we're all on the same page?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, because I can tell you we have, behind closed doors in NATO, and that's up to the ministerial level, constant discussions amongst ourselves to ensure that we are helping the Afghans build the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan in a model which is their model, and not trying to impose something which cannot fit on them. There are, of course, certain requirements for us, and those requirements are adherence to fundamental human rights. That includes, of course, protection of minorities, women's rights, and those things are enshrined in the Constitution, and that's a good thing for us. And we hold the Afghan government to those Afghan constitutionally enshrined principles, which are absolutely important to us. We cannot get into a situation where our populations are saying people over to support that. That is critical. Then you see this mission come under very, very great pressure. So basic principle is it's their country, they have to build it in their model, but our support is for their constitution, and their constitution enshrines principles with which, in which we believe very fundamentally. on narcotics. President Karzai is very clear. He's clear in public and in private that he considers the narcotics trade to be wrong, un-Islamic. He knows, and I think anyone who looks dispassionately at this knows. In other words, anyone who's not driving in a Lincoln Navigator because they run the crop. It corrupts the economy, it corrupts governance, it corrupts the police, and it fuels the insurgency. So there's nobody who has the best interests of Afghanistan in mind, including the elected government, who wants this trade to continue. The challenge is how to tackle it. There's a lot of discussions of legalization, et cetera, et cetera. The NATO point of view, I think, is very close to the UN point of view. The UN point of view is legalization is impossible, even on a trial basis. It is disruptive to talk about it, and we should focus on a more effective counter-narcotics effort. But NATO, again, not eating all or falling in the butter, not eating all, certainly not falling in the butter. We cannot lead on the counter-narcotics effort, but I think you will see in the coming months that within the operational plan you will see a maximalist approach to support for the Afghan authorities.
Thank you. And front again, yeah.
Oh, sorry, yeah, slightly woolly question maybe, but I know that there's been a lot of, it's reported there's been a lot of resentment within NATO among certain countries who are taking bullets. So the Canadians, the Brits, the Dutch particularly, they're the ones in the front line, and rules of engagement in other countries preclude them from serving in places like Helmand and Kandahar. Where's that debate at the moment, and is NATO making an effort to try and persuade the Germans, for example, to step up to the plate?
The debate in NATO is like this. Certainly in NATO, the Secretary General, and he's not alone, would like to see the minimum number of restrictions on the troops the country sent to Afghanistan, caveats as we call them, and that includes very much what is probably the most operationally relevant one, and that's movement between geographic zones. That's a principle we would like to see put in place as much as possible. But we also have to be realistic. In Germany, I do not see the political constellation now or in the near future that will allow a government to announce that it's moving wholesale combat troops into the south of Afghanistan. It seems unrealistic to me, and I think to any observer of the German political scene. Let's not also forget, Germany's name comes up all the time. I'm not really sure why. It's only the Germans that get picked on, but they have 3,500 troops doing a very important job in the north, and if they leave, the north is a big open area for someone else to go in. Kabul, you can talk about, the French should move or the French should not move, but as we have seen, Kabul is not safe. Kabul also needs its 6,000 troops there to help keep, and this is the strategic center of gravity of the country. So everybody's doing an important job where they are. I mentioned this provincial model, which has reinforced a tendency to stay where you are because you've invested in that area and you're reluctant to kind of pull up roots. You've got major development projects that are halfway finished or just started. You just got to know the people in the neighborhood. They've just come to trust you, and then you leave. Already the rotation issue, which you mentioned, is challenging enough for the military, but to leave wholesale from the region is something that's hard to convince them to do. All this to say, yes, we would like more rotation. Yes, we would like to see fewer restrictions. It doesn't seem to be on the horizon right now, but we are pushing very hard for it. I think the answer to this, in many ways, is the Afghans. A year and a half ago, as far as I'm aware, there were no Afghan battalions in Kandahar. Now there are 2 Afghan battalions in Kandahar for the 1 Canadian battalion, and they are very, very active. There are more and more of them being produced, and as time goes on, if we can hold our breath, you will see more of them moving into these zones. And that, to me, is the future for their country.
But isn't the same model going to persist somewhere else? You might get a completely different country where there are no Afghans, but still it's the Dutch and the Canadians taking bullets and the Germans are doing something different in the north of the country. I don't know wherever else you might deploy in the future.
Is that possible? I suppose it's possible, but we're not there yet. I do think, however, that the lesson that I just mentioned to you, this provincial model and the effects of it when it comes to rotation, is something that's very alive in NATO. We understand the challenges that this has posed. It has great advantages as well. You do get to know the people, you do get to know the area, and you can have a joined-up government approach. In other words, your development and military and diplomatic people are all together. They're in a provincial reconstruction team. They're focused. You get expertise because people cycle in and out. So there are great advantages to this system, but there are big disadvantages as well, and we'll take these lessons into account the next time.
There's a lady at the back.
Thank you. My name is Gabby Francis Walker. There are a lot of people who believe that the front line of international terrorism lies in Britain and Pakistan. How would NATO explain to those people their role in fighting the Taliban, who are not declared international jihadists?
I'm sorry, the front line of terrorism is in Pakistan and Britain, did you say?
Yes. I mean, because there are so many cells here.
Well, I don't know whether, I don't want to comment on the terror situation in the UK because I simply don't know a lot about it. What is
Michael Chertoff yesterday, the Homeland Security
Yes, I saw the
Secretary, mentioned the fact that Europe and Britain was more of a front line, but he was referring to America, obviously.
I think sometimes things that are obvious are worth repeating. 6 years ago, Afghanistan was, 7 years ago, was the Grand Central Station of terrorism. And you had terrorists, extremists from at least a dozen countries, Arabs, from China, from Central Asia, coming there, training, and redeploying out to their home countries, better trained, better equipped, fiercer, and more extreme, and launching terrorist attacks all over the world. These people have not gone away. They're still there. They will do exactly what they did before. The 20/20 hindsight is something we should grip onto. It's 20/20 hindsight, what Afghanistan will be if we don't succeed there in making this an inhospitable environment for those people. And so we have to do it. I mean, that to me is the bottom line if you're talking about the terrorism aspect of this. There's a basic human rights aspect to all of this, which I think cannot be ignored. There's the support for the UN aspect, but the merits of tackling terrorism there so that it doesn't come here cannot be disputed. They simply cannot be disputed. Somebody wants to dispute it.
In the middle there, yeah.
I'm disputing something else. Rolling up on the issue of caveats, I was home.
Sorry, and you are?
I'm Jennifer Quinn. I'm formerly of the Toronto Star and the Associated Press. I was home in December, and there was a number of deaths of Canadian soldiers reported. And every time that happens, it seems like there's a collective national intake of breath and sort of a concern about where Canadians are in Afghanistan. And what I'm wondering is, as you know, Canadians start to feel that they're shouldering more and more of the burden, and I'm sure the Brits feel the same way. What does NATO do to sort of help the national mood and prevent that from becoming an issue where Canadians say, this is none of our business, we want out, or to that extent, Brits, this is none of our business, we want out? How does NATO help solve that problem?
Well, I think the first challenge is precisely this straw model. Canadians, and you know, I was just there 2 days ago, and you constantly get the question, why are we the only ones fighting? And in fact, there are 11 or 12 countries in the south alone. They're all fighting together. They've all taken casualties, some in significant numbers, 2 Dutch just a couple of days ago, as you know. But you get the same discussion in The Hague, and you get the same discussion here in London. So one of the great challenges that we have is simply showing that we're not alone there, that Canadians are not sharing the burden alone, nor the Brits, nor the Dutch. And you know, the Danes and the Romanians and the Poles feel a little bit annoyed when everybody says it's just those 3 countries, and they're there too, and they're taking casualties too. And as we've seen in Kabul, even there they're not free. So I think one of the major responsibilities that I have, and the Secretary General of course has, is simply to do that. Show the broader picture, and we do try to do that. We've done that, of course, with as many countries as we can. The second challenge is to, of course, help when it comes to finding partners, and NATO does do that. Our Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, who works down in Mons, just south of our headquarters, he's on the phone every day, all the time, trying to drum up support, trying to make deals, trying to find partnerships. And as you've seen, the French have moved Mirages down to Kandahar airfield. and we will see what else may come up in the coming months and years. And of course, the Americans have announced 2,000 fighters who will be in the south as well, at least for a limited period. But you're quite right that the public challenge, certainly in Canada, is very much related in the end to casualty levels. We have to make the case, I have to make the case, and my boss too, constantly, that this is worth doing. But I think where we are weak at NATO, and I'm trying to move this a little bit, where we are weak is showing people the narrative of where we're going. Our publics, I find, in general, too much see this as a stalemate. They don't question whether it's worth doing. They ask, is it winnable, and are we winning? And that's where we have to answer the question. Yes, it's winnable. Are we winning? I have to be able to substantiate that to Canadians and then say, hold your breath, we're getting there, and we'll get there by a certain period. And we have not been nearly effective enough in telling that story. And I'm hoping that at Bucharest I'll be able to have a more coherent story that I can substantiate, not just for Canadians, which will have probably gone through the whole discussion of the Manley report, but for the broader NATO public, to give people a vision of where it's going. That, I think, is a critical shortfall of my organization.
We've got time for one, maybe two. Yes, please. Yep.
A double question, but I'll make it very fast. One is somebody like Rory Stewart would suggest that you cannot win in the south, and therefore you should recognise what is realistically possible and accept that. And a sort of an adjunct to that is that with allies like the government in Kabul, who will expel people like Michael Semple and Mervyn Patterson, you have problems. So that's a double question.
I didn't really hear a question, but I take the point. We don't accept that you can't win because, A, we think you can win, depends how you define win. Can we empower or help the Afghans empower themselves to be able to fight their own fight? Yes, we can do that. And we're doing it. And it's working. With my great respect for Rory Stewart, whom I've read the Walking Across Afghanistan book, and I've seen his work in the Turquoise Mountain Foundation. I have no disrespect for him, but I don't think NATO shares that point of view at all. And we have a number of people who know Afghanistan relatively well. This comes back to what we were discussing before. The Afghan government is sovereign, and it takes its own decisions on what happens in its own country, and we have to accept that. I'm not making any comment on the ejection of these two gentlemen. I don't know exactly what they were doing. I've seen all the press reporting on the various viewpoints on what they were doing. We have to insist on what we do and on the basic human rights and values that we value, and we do that. But we also have to respect the fact that this is their country, and we will never be able to walk away until they're able to stand on their own feet. So we have to empower them to make their own decisions and then not try to yank the carpet out from under them when they make a decision we don't like. That's not the way it's going to work. Sometimes we have to choke it down.
Unless someone desperately wants another question. Okay, one more.
It'll be a short answer.
Paddy Ashdown in the past has said that he believed NATO is losing the war in Afghanistan. How are you going to bring him into line?
Has anyone brought Paddy Ashdown into line ever? Well, first, let us not prejudge that he will be named to this position, because that is absolutely not yet decided or announced anyway. I'm trying to be, I'm not even saying it's decided. You journalists. I think Lord Ashdown thinks that, if I note his spokesperson, Lord Ashdown has also said publicly he thinks that the effort can be turned around. And that the key is, from what I've seen from his public statements, better civilian coordination, and certainly I know that the thinking with regard to the super envoy, whoever it is, will be precisely focused on two things. One is, and primarily on, civilian coordination, and secondly, better coordination with the military. Let me say, I agree with Lord Ashdown to this extent. If we don't do better, much better at coordination, we will be there a much greater period of time. There has to be a stepped-up effort. NATO wants this. We want a stronger, coordinated UN effort, and we want to work with, in a more close way, whoever's put at the head of it. So if that happens, whoever's put there, whenever the decision is taken and announced, we will support it.
I think we have to end. I promised James 9 o'clock. It's 9 o'clock. Go on then.
Over the next 5 years, that he, sorry, our speaker forgot his name.
Yeah, I didn't hear the
Can't hear.
question.
Sorry.
That's it.
No, sorry, does he have a prognostication of the casualty rate that NATO is likely to endure if they are there for, say, 5 years?
I have no way, I think, to predict that. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, foreign fighters are relying more and more on, as we all know, suicide bombs and roadside bombs. I could not possibly predict casualty levels for NATO forces, for Afghans. I think that's just impossible. I can tell you if they stop fighting, casualty levels will drop significantly, but...
That's a good answer. We started on Afghanistan and we've ended on Afghanistan. It's not really surprising. This is the way ahead for NATO, I think, for the next... you say 5 years, I say 25 years. I'm sure they'll still be there in 25 years' time. Thank you all very much. Some very sparky questions. James, you've been exceptionally professional in all your answers. You haven't,
that's no compliment, yeah.
You haven't erred or ummed once. No, you've been very entertaining and extremely good answers, and thank you very much for all coming.
Thank you.